If you scream out here, honey, nobody's coming. He said it with a smile. That was the worst part. Emily Carter didn't move, didn't breathe. Her hands pressed flat against the counter, and she felt the wood grain dig into her palms like it was the only real thing left in the world. She had 8 seconds to decide. Her son was upstairs. If this story hit you, subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The first time Derek Voss came back into Emily Carter's life, she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning. She was standing at the kitchen sink washing Noah's breakfast bowl when she saw the shadow pass across the window, slow, deliberate, like something that wanted to be seen. She turned. The driveway was empty. The road beyond the fence was empty. The flat open land that stretched for half a mile in every direction was empty. But she knew. The way you know when a door opens in the dark, not by sound, by pressure, by the way the air changes. She set the bowl down, dried her hands on a dish towel, and told herself it was a deer. She was good at telling herself things. She'd had 4 years of practice. Emily had moved to this part of northern Arizona with purpose. She wanted invisible. After everything that happened in Phoenix, after the courtroom, after Derek's lawyer had stood up in a suit that cost more than her car and said the words insufficient evidence, with such calm authority that Emily had felt the ground disappear under her feet, she wanted a place where no one knew her name, where Noah could grow up without knowing what fear smelled like. Y'all, she found it. A weathered house on a county road that saw maybe 12 cars on a busy day. A job at Hattie's Diner 20 minutes south where the coffee was burned and the regulars were loyal and nobody asked questions that didn't relate to pie. She built something small and quiet, fragile as a soap bubble. And then 3 weeks ago, her neighbor Marta's old dog started barking in the night. Every night. 3 nights in a row, Emily stood at her bedroom window in the dark and watched the dog pace the fence line, ears flat, hackles up, staring at the same spot on the road. Not moving, just staring. On the 4th morning, she found boot prints in the mud on the far side of her fence. Large, heavy, deliberate. She'd taken a picture, stared at it for a long time. Then she'd made the mistake of calling the county sheriff's non-emergency line, and a deputy had come out, looked at the prints for 30 seconds and said, "Ma'am, this is open country, could be anybody, hikers, hunters. There's nothing to hunt here," she'd said. He'd looked at her in that particular way, the way men in certain uniforms look at women they've already decided are anxious, and said, "I'll have a unit drive the road a couple times this week." He said it the same way people say, "We'll keep you in our prayers." Present tense kindness with no future attached. That was the last time Emily called anyone. Derek Voss had done 4 years at Florence State Prison for aggravated assault and weapons charges. Emily knew this because she'd set up a prison release notification through victim services, one of the few things the system had actually delivered. She'd gotten the email 14 months ago. She'd printed it, folded it, put it in a kitchen drawer, and tried to forget what his face looked like when he was angry. She couldn't. She'd met Derek when she was 24, when she was still the kind of person who mistook intensity for passion. He was handsome in a way that made you feel chosen, confident in a way that made you feel safe right up until the moment that same confidence turned on you like a closed fist. Noah was 2 years old when Emily left. She'd packed one bag while Derek slept, and she'd driven through the night with one hand on the wheel and in one hand resting on Noah's car seat, feeling his small chest rise and fall, thinking this is enough. This is the reason. This is the only reason I need. She'd testified. She'd done everything right. And the jury had looked at Derek's lawyer's suit and decided it wasn't quite enough. She understood now in the marrow of her bones that the justice system was not designed for women like her. It was designed to manage the risk of embarrassment for people with more resources. She wasn't bitter about it. Bitterness required energy she'd long since redirected. She just planned accordingly. The second time she knew it was Derek, she was at work. Hattie's Diner sat at the intersection of Route 89 and a county road that didn't have a name on most maps. It was the kind of place that survived because truckers needed coffee and locals needed somewhere to sit that wasn't their own house. The booths were red vinyl with cracks patched by mismatched tape. The jukebox hadn't worked since 2019. And Hattie herself, a 67-year-old woman with forearms like a longshoreman and a voice that could stop a room, ran it with the particular iron grace of someone who had given up on other people's opinions 30 years ago. When Emily had worked there for 2 years, she knew every regular by name, by order, by the particular silence they preferred in the morning. She knew which truckers were kind and which ones she needed to watch. She knew the rhythms of the place the way you know your own heartbeat. She was refilling coffee at table 4 when she looked through the front window and saw the car. Black, older model, parked across the road, nose pointing south, engine running. She could see the exhaust in the morning cold. She couldn't see the driver. She stood there for 3 full seconds with the coffee pot in her hand, and Jimmy Rourke, retired postal worker, table 4, black coffee, 2 sugars, said, "You okay, sweetheart? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," she said, and refilled his cup and did not look at the window again. The car was gone when she checked 20 minutes later, but the feeling didn't leave. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark listening to Noah breathe through the baby monitor she still kept. He was 8 years old, and she knew it was strange, and she didn't care. And she tried to build a plan out of the raw materials she had. Oh, she had a phone. She had a neighbor half a mile away. She had a job that put her in public 6 hours a day. She had a son who thought camping was an adventure, and bad dreams were just stories your brain told by accident. She did not have a car that could outrun anyone. She did not have family close enough to matter. She did not have money for motels or lawyers or private security. She did not have proof. She was thinking about proof when it came to her. She sat up. Her mind went to something she'd read years ago, some news story she barely remembered about a woman who'd hidden messages in everyday objects, signals that looked like nothing, that could only be decoded by someone who already knew what to look for. She thought, what if the help you need is already driving past you? What if it just doesn't know to stop? She got out of bed at 2 in the morning, went to the shed and found the old can of red exterior paint. She worked until almost 4. When she was done, she stepped back and looked at the mailbox. It looked like decoration, geometric lines, small triangles in a pattern that repeated every few inches around the post. A modest handmade touch, the kind of thing you'd see on any rural property in the Southwest, where people paint their own things and don't much care what anyone thinks. Unless you knew Morse code. Then you saw it immediately. 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. Wisdom is ours esos. She'd hidden it in the angles of the triangles. The short strokes were dots. The long strokes were dashes. She'd broken the pattern just enough that it looked organic, decorative, unless your eye was trained to read it. She didn't know if anyone passing would recognize it. She painted it anyway, because doing something is the last defense against losing your mind when doing nothing is the only other option. The next morning, Derek Voss called her phone. She didn't answer. He called again. She didn't answer. Then he texted. 1 sentence, no punctuation, no capitalization, the way he always wrote when he was making a point. "I just wanted to say hi." She stared at those words for a long time. Then she screenshotted the message, sent it to an email address she'd created specifically for this purpose, and blocked the number. He'd have another number within the hour. She knew that. She was right. He called from a new number at 9:47 a.m. while she was driving Noah to school. This time she answered. "Emily." His voice, 4 years older, roughly the same weight, the same particular quality, smooth on the surface with something moving underneath it like water over rock. "Derek, you sound tense." He made a noise that was almost a laugh. "I just wanted to see how you're doing. It's been a while." "Don't call this number again. Noah must be, 8 now? Time goes." A pause, a long one, the kind he was always good at. "You know I never blamed you, right, for any of it. That's what I want you to know. I never held it against you." Her hands were tight on the wheel. Noah was in the back seat, headphones in, staring at his tablet, mercifully sealed off from the world. "Derek, if you come near my house, I'll call." "Mega who?" He said it quietly, with genuine curiosity in his voice, like it was a real question. "Emily, think about who you're about to say. The sheriff, they couldn't find a footprint 2 feet from your fence." Another pause. "I'm not threatening you. I want to be clear about that. I'm just asking a sincere question. Who do you think is going to come? She hung up. She sat in the school parking lot for 4 minutes after Noah went inside, hands in her lap, staring at the windshield. He was right, and they both knew that. That was the worst part. Not that he was cruel, that he was correct. She doubled down on the mailbox that afternoon. She added a second layer of border around the base of the post just in case someone might see it from a different angle. She made the pattern slightly more prominent, slightly more exact. Marta, her neighbor, pulled over in her truck that afternoon and called out through the window, "That's real pretty, Emily. Real nice touch." "Thank you," Emily said. "You doing okay out here? You seem—" Marta hesitated. "I don't know, like you're listening for something." Emily smiled. She was good at smiles that meant nothing. "I'm fine, just keeping busy." Marta looked at her a moment longer than was comfortable, then nodded. "Okay, well, you know where I am." Emily watched her drive away. She thought Marta's half a mile away, 63 years old and alone too. If she called Marta, she'd just be putting another woman in Derek's path. She turned back to the mailbox. She painted more carefully, more deliberately. Come on, she thought. Someone, anyone. Just notice it all. Days passed, cars passed, the trucks, families on their way somewhere. A school bus that ran the route twice a day, a county vehicle, a mail carrier who opened the mailbox, dropped in the water bill, and left without looking, twice for noise. Every morning, Emily came outside and checked the road. Every night, she checked the locks. Derek didn't come to the door. That was the thing about him. He was patient in a way that most violent men weren't. He understood that fear was cumulative, that the point wasn't to break a door down. The point was to make someone stand behind the door thinking about whether it was strong enough. He texted from different numbers. Not every day, every few days. Just enough to stop the silence from feeling safe. One night, nice mailbox. She felt the message like cold water down her back. He'd driven past. He'd seen it. He hadn't recognized it for what it was, or if he had, he didn't care. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she came downstairs and found Noah at the kitchen table already dressed, eating cereal backpack on perfectly, composed in the way of 8-year-old boys who have absorbed anxiety from the air around them and decided that being ready is the best response. "Mom," he said without looking up, "is everything okay?" She crossed to him and kissed the top of his head. "Everything's fine, buddy. You keep checking the locks." Old habit. He looked up at her and then his eyes, Derek's eyes, the one thing she could never escape, steady and too old for his age. "Is it the man?" Her heart stopped. "What man, Noah?" "I don't know. The man you talk to Marta about in a low voice when you think I'm watching TV." He picked up his spoon. "I'm not scared. I just want to know so I can help." She sat down across from him, took a breath. "There's nothing to help with," she said. "I'm taking care of it. The best way I know how." He looked at her for a long moment with those two old eyes. Then he nodded, picked up his backpack, and said, "Okay, but I want you to know I can be loud if I need to be. Coach says I've got good lungs." She almost laughed. Almost. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. It was 12 days after she'd first painted the mailbox when everything changed. She heard them before she saw them, a deep rolling thunder from the north, growing steadily, the kind of sound that turns heads and settles into your chest. She was in the front yard hanging laundry on the line when the sound became distinct enough to separate into its components engines. Multiple. Motorcycles. A lot of them. She'd seen bikers on Route 89 before. It wasn't uncommon, but they usually moved in small groups or alone. This was different. This was organized. A convoy moving south at a measured pace, deliberate, unhurried. She didn't stop what she was doing. She kept her hands on the sheet she was folding, but her eyes went to the road. 30, maybe more. Big road bikes, a couple touring models, a patchwork of machines, but all of them ridden with the same particular ease riders who had spent thousands of hours on the road and had long since made peace with the machine between their legs. She clocked their cuts from 50 yards. Dark leather, a patch on the back she couldn't read at distance but recognized in shape. And then something she didn't expect. The front of the convoy slowed. One hand went up, a single raised fist from the lead rider, and the entire column began to stop. Not scatter, not pause. Stop. Organized. Deliberate. The lead bike pulled to the shoulder. The rider sat for a moment without getting off, just looked at her mailbox. Emily's hands went still. She felt her breath change. The rider swung off the bike with the economy of movement that belongs only to men who've been doing the same thing for decades. He pulled off his helmet, older, hard-faced, gray-streaked, the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved out of something unyielding. He stood in front of her mailbox for a long moment. She watched him reach out and trace one finger along the geometric border, slowly, deliberately following the pattern of triangles. He stopped. He looked up. He looked directly at her. And in that moment, across 40 feet of gravel and dead grass and open air, Emily Carter understood something she had almost stopped believing was true. Someone had finally seen it. The man didn't shout, didn't wave, didn't perform anything for her benefit. He just turned back to the others, said something in a voice too low for her to hear, and two more riders stepped off their bikes. Then he looked at her again, steady, direct, no performance in it, and he said in a voice that carried clean across the yard, "Ma'am, you okay in there?" 3 words she had not heard anyone say with actual intention in 3 weeks. Her throat closed. Her hands were shaking. She opened her mouth, and behind her, from inside the house, she heard a door. Not Noah's door. A different door. The back door. Her body knew before her mind caught up. Her eyes went to the man on the road. His eyes went to the house. He'd heard it too. And the careful, quiet neutrality on his face shifted into something else entirely. Something that if you were in the wrong position, if you were, say, a man who had spent the last 3 weeks counting on no one showing up, would have made you go very, very still. The sound of that back door didn't belong to the house. Emily knew every sound her house made. She knew the particular groan of the third stair, the way the kitchen faucet clicked twice before it ran cold, the specific drag of Noah's bedroom door against the carpet when he pushed it too fast. She knew this house the way you know a body you've lived in, every ache, every rhythm, every wrong note. That door opened too quietly. Practice quiet, the kind that comes from someone who has opened doors they weren't supposed to open before. Mister, the man on the road, she still didn't know his name, had gone completely still. Not frozen, still. The way a person goes still when they've already started calculating and don't want the calculation interrupted by motion. His eyes moved to the side of the house without his head following them. A slight thing, a train thing. He said without raising his voice, "Marcus." He uttered one word, and behind him one of the riders who'd stepped off his bike moved. Not toward Emily, around, to the left. Wide arc, easy pace like a man stretching his legs after a long ride. Emily's heart was slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She thought about Noah. 2nd floor, his room faced the backyard. She took one step toward the house, and the man on the road said quietly, but with an authority that stopped her like a hand against her sternum, "Don't go inside yet." She turned back to him. "My son is how old? 8. Where in the house?" "Upstairs. His room faces the back." He said it like he was completing a sentence he'd already written in his head. "Is there a lock on the door, Mom?" "Yes." "Does he know to use it?" "Mom." That stopped her. She opened her mouth and closed it. Noah's voice came back to her from that morning at the kitchen table. "I'm not scared. I just want to know so I can help." And she felt something crack open behind her ribs. "I don't know," she said, and her voice broke on the last word. "Just slightly. Just enough." The man looked at her with something that wasn't pity and wasn't indifference. It was a specific kind of attention, the kind that gathers information without making you feel dissected. "What's his name?" "Noah." He nodded once, turned his head a fraction, and said to the man who hadn't moved, "Real." Another rider peeled away from the group, moved to the far right side of the road, and pulled out a phone. Emily watched him type something, hold the phone to his ear, say something she couldn't hear. She said, "What is he doing?" "Checking the other side of your property from the road." He held her gaze. "I need you to tell me who's in that house that shouldn't be." And there it was. The question she'd been trying to answer for weeks in the privacy of her own head in the dark, with no one to hear it and no safe way to say it out loud. She said his name for the first time since she'd blocked his number. Derek Voss. She watched the man absorb that, His face didn't change, but something behind it did. He's been watching you, he said, not a question. 3 weeks. He was in prison. He got out 14 months ago, and I thought. She stopped, pressed her hands together, started again. He doesn't come to the door. He never does anything you can point at. He just makes sure you know he's there. Until today. Until today, she repeated. A beat of silence. Then he said, I'm Jackson. What do they call you? Emily. Emily. He said her name like he was filing it somewhere precise. I need you to walk toward me. Not running, just walk. She moved without deciding to. Her feet crossed the gravel before her brain fully issued the order. She stopped when she reached the road edge 8 feet from him, and he turned so that his back was to her, facing the house, not her, and she understood immediately. He was putting himself between her and the door. From inside the house, nothing. From the convoy, total quiet, 30 men on motorcycles, and not one of them made a sound. That silence was the most organized thing she had ever witnessed. Then Marcus, the one who'd circled left, reappeared around the corner of the house and walked directly to Jackson. He spoke low, quick, 4 sentences. Emily caught pieces, back doors open, fresh mud on the steps, one set of prints moving toward the kitchen. Jackson's jaw moved. He looked at Emily. Is there anything in your kitchen he'd want? She almost said no. Then she remembered. Her face changed and Jackson caught it. What's in the kitchen, Emily? My phone, she said. I leave it charging on the counter and the drawer by the stove. I have a folder in there. Documentation, texts he sent, the pictures of the boot prints, everything I've been saving. The silence that followed was so complete she could hear a bird somewhere in the brush. Then Jackson said, He's not here for you today. She stared at him. He's here to take your evidence, he said. Folder's gone, you've got nothing. He knows that. The truth of it hit her like cold water. Of course. That was exactly how Derek thought. Not with violence, not when there was a cleaner option. Remove the proof, put her back to 0, make her start the whole terrible count from scratch with nothing to show anyone. He came in the back, she said, her voice thin. He came in the back while I was in the front yard, so I'd be outside and he'd be in and out before anyone saw. Jackson said it quietly, not to her anymore, to himself. He turned and looked at the house for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, Ray, Boone, with me. She tried to follow, and Jackson stopped her with a look not harsh, not unkind, the way a surgeon looks at someone who wants to hold a scalpel. Stay with Hector, he said, and a compact, quiet man in his 50s materialized at her left shoulder like he'd been standing there the whole time. Ma'am, Hector said with the simplest courtesy she'd been shown in weeks. She stood in the road and watched Jackson and 2 others enter her house through the front door. The wait was the worst thing she had ever lived through, and she had lived through some bad things. Hector stood close enough to be a presence without crowding her. He didn't talk. She found herself grateful for that. She didn't need words. She needed someone between her and whatever was about to happen. 45 seconds passed. Then she heard Derek's voice from inside the house. She couldn't make out the words, but she knew the register that particular pitch he reached when he was cornered and trying to talk himself out of a corner. Smooth, reasonable, explaining why everything was a misunderstanding. She had heard that voice in a courtroom. She had watched it work, her hands balled into fists at her sides. Hector, without looking at her, said, It won't work this time. She looked at him. Whatever he's saying in there, Hector said quietly, it won't work this time. Jackson's heard every version of that speech. How do you know what version he's giving? Hector almost smiled. Because there's only one version, just different words. A crash from inside. Something falling, not breaking, just hitting the floor hard. Then Derek's voice again, louder with an edge in it now. The edge that came when Smooth stopped working. Emily took 1 step toward the house. Hector said, Emily. She stopped. I know, he said. I know exactly what you want to do right now. But Jackson has it. My son. Real confirmed the upstairs windows are closed and the lights on in the second room from the left. He's in there. He's fine. She exhaled. Her knees felt wrong. How does Real know which room is his? Hector looked at her steadily. Because you've got a poster on the window. Dinosaurs looks like. Noah's dinosaur poster. He'd taped it up himself 3 months ago, proud as anything. She put her hand over her mouth. She was not going to cry. She had decided that weeks ago, and she intended to keep the decision. She did not entirely manage it. Hector looked away, giving her the privacy of not being watched. It was a small grace. She registered it. Derek came out the front door under his own power. That was the first thing that she noticed. Jackson hadn't dragged him. He was walking, but his walk was different from the walk she remembered, the loose, unhurried stride of a man who believed the world arranged itself around him. That walk was gone. He was moving like a man who had been reminded recently, and specifically, of the exact dimensions of his own size. He had her folder in his left hand. He had tried to take her folder. Jackson walked behind him with the folder tucked under one arm, like it was a newspaper. Derek saw Emily the moment he cleared the door. He stopped. For the first time in 3 weeks, she was looking directly at him. Not through a window, not in memory, right there 10 feet away in the ordinary daylight of an Arizona afternoon. He looked older, harder. The prison had etched something into him that wasn't there before, or maybe it had always been there, and she'd spent 2 years looking past it when she was 24 and still confusing intensity for something it was not. He looked at her, then at the convoy, then back at her. And this was the thing she had not expected, the thing that would stay with her. He smiled. Not the cornered smile, not the explaining smile, a real one, quiet and ugly and certain. Emily, he said, this is something. She didn't answer. You painted your mailbox, he said. I thought that was cute. I really did. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was cute. You making little decorations? He tilted his head. Where'd you learn Morse code? Go away, Derek. Oh, I'm going. He glanced back at Jackson, then at the men flanking him. Big show, huh? Whole cavalry. He shook his head slowly. Emily, honey, this isn't over because a bunch of, Jackson said one word, enough. He said it the way some men can say one word and turn a room into a held breath. Derek went quiet. Well, not because he was afraid, or not only because he was afraid, because there was something in Jackson's voice that had no interest in negotiating with him. No performance in it, no escalation, no invitation to continue the back and forth. It was the voice of a man who had already made every decision and was simply waiting for the other party to accept the terms. Silence held for 3 full seconds. Then Derek looked at Emily one more time. You think this fixes it, he said. I think you need to leave, she said. And I think you know that if you don't, today gets a lot longer. Something moved across his face. She couldn't name it exactly, not fear, but adjacent to it, the recognition of a situation that had stopped being the one he'd planned for. He looked at the convoy, at the men, at the road stretching both directions with nowhere in particular to run to. He said, fine. He said it like it cost him nothing, like he was choosing it freely. She knew he was not choosing it freely, but she also knew that in this moment it didn't matter. Jackson held out the folder. Derek didn't reach for it. Jackson looked at Emily and walked it directly to her and put it in her hands. She felt the weight of it, 3 weeks of screenshots and notes and photographs, all of it still there to them. Jackson said quietly, only to her, that folder doesn't stay in a kitchen drawer after today. No, she agreed, it doesn't. You have somewhere safe, someone you trust. She thought of Marta, half a mile away, 63 years old with a fireproof safe in her bedroom because she didn't trust banks. Yes, she said. Good. He stepped back. 2 of the riders had moved Derek gently but with absolute physical certainty to the edge of the road. Not touching him more than necessary, not threatening anything out loud, just arranged the situation so that the available space was the space they decided it was. Derek found his car parked on a dirt pull-off 40 yards north, half hidden behind brush, which told Emily everything about how deliberate today had been, and he got in. He didn't peel out. He didn't make a show of it. He just drove south. Emily watched until the car was gone. Her hands were completely steady on the folder. She did not understand how. Some deep part of her had locked itself into place and would not release until Noah was in her arms and the door was closed. On as if on cue, she heard the front door of the house open. She turned. Noah stood in the doorway in his socked feet, backpack still on from school that morning, looking at the convoy in the road with the undefended astonishment of an 8-year-old who has just discovered that the world contains things far stranger and more interesting than he'd been told. "Mom, Assam," he said, "are those Hell's Angels?" A sound came out of Emily that she hadn't produced in 3 weeks, a short, involuntary laugh, the kind that happens before you can stop it. "Come here," she said. He crossed the yard at a run and hit her like he always did, full force, arms around her waist, face pressed into her side. She held the folder in one hand and put the other arm around him and held on. She looked at Jackson over the top of her son's head. He was watching them both with the expression of a man who has seen enough of the world to know which moments are worth keeping quiet for. She said, "How did you know the mailbox? How did you recognize it?" He was quiet for a moment. "My father was a ham radio operator," he said. "Taught me Morse code when I was 7 years old. Said a man should know how to send a message when the normal lines are down." He paused. "I haven't used it in 40 years. But that pattern," he glanced at the mailbox. "You don't forget some things." She looked at the mailbox, the triangles, the careful angles she'd painted in the dark at 2 in the morning with shaking hands and no real certainty that anyone would ever understand. "I didn't know if it would work," she said. "It worked," he said. For the next 20 minutes, the convoy sat with its engines off. And 3 of the riders went inside at Emily's invitation and walked through the house, not searching exactly, but the way experienced people move through a space when they want to verify that a threat has actually left it. They checked the back door, checked the lock. One of them, a bearded man named Cole, found the window latch on the ground floor bathroom that Derek had clearly worked loose, probably on a previous visit, probably weeks ago, probably as an insurance policy. Cole held it up without comment. Emily stared at it. "He's been able to get in," she said. "If he'd wanted to," Cole said. "He wanted you to know he could. That's different from wanting to." She understood. That was exactly Derek's method, the threat that lives in the knowledge of vulnerability. You don't have to break the door down if the person behind it can never stop thinking about how thin the door is. She had a new latch installed from a hardware kit one of the riders produced from his saddlebag within the hour. Noah handed tools when asked. He was very serious about this. Jackson sat at her kitchen table while this happened. She made coffee without being asked because her hands needed something to do. She put a mug in front of him, and he wrapped both hands around it and didn't say anything for a moment. "Then, do you have a lawyer?" "I can't afford." "I didn't ask if you could afford one. I asked if you have one." She met his eyes. "No." "You will by Friday," he said. It wasn't a boast. It was a fact delivery. She didn't know what to say to that. She said, "You don't have to." That folder needs to be with someone official before Derek finds a new angle. Evidence like that, it sits in a kitchen drawer. He'll find another way to make it disappear. It needs to be submitted, formally, with your statement attached. He took a drink of coffee. "I know someone who takes cases like this. She's good." "Why are you doing this?" The question came out before she'd shaped it carefully, and she regretted the nakedness of it for a second before deciding she didn't. Jackson set the mug down. He looked at the table for a moment before looking at her. "My daughter," he said, 12 years ago. Different situation, same shape." He stopped. "We got there too late." The kitchen held that silence with both hands. Emily didn't say she was sorry. It felt too small. She just held the weight of what he'd shared and let it sit there. Noah came in from the other room and stood in the doorway looking at Jackson. "Are you the leader?" he asked. Jackson looked at him. "Something like that." "Did you see the mailbox?" "I did." Noah nodded slowly, processing. "Mom made that." "I know she did." "She's really smart," Noah said, with total, simple certainty, not performing it, just stating a fact that he couldn't imagine anyone disputing. Jackson looked at Emily. "Yeah," he said, "she is." "On." The convoy left in the late afternoon. And they didn't announce it. The engines started one by one, and the sound built back to that rolling thunder she'd heard from the north, and then they were moving south unhurried, organized the same as they had arrived. Jackson was last. He sat on his bike at the end of her driveway for a moment with the engine running helmet in his hand. He looked at the mailbox one more time. Then he looked at her. The lawyer's name is Sandra Reeves, he said at Flagstaff. Tell her Jackson Hayes sent you. She'll know what that means. Okay, Emily said. Lock the bathroom window even with the new latch. Habit. Okay. And Emily, he paused. You did the right thing. Painting that. A lot of people would have just waited. She looked at the mailbox, at the careful angles, at the message she'd hidden in plain sight for 12 days while cars drove past and the world kept moving. I didn't know what else to do, she said. That's usually when people figure out what they're capable of, he said. He put his helmet on. He rode south. She stood in the driveway until the sound of the engines faded into the distance and the road was quiet again. Noah came and stood beside her. He slipped his hand into hers. Are they coming back? He asked. She looked at the empty road for a long moment. I don't think they need to, she said. She squeezed his hand. Come on, she said. Let's fix that window latch properly. Then we'll call Marta. They went inside. Behind them, the mailbox stood in the afternoon light, the careful pattern of triangles catching the sun. An ordinary thing now again, just paint and wood and an old post set in the earth. But inside that ordinary thing, if you knew how to look, if someone had taught you the way a father teaches a 7-year-old boy on a quiet afternoon, that a man should always know how to send a message when the normal lines are down, you could still see it. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. We are here, we are okay. Someone finally stopped. Marta picked up on the second ring. Emily hadn't planned what she was going to say. She stood in her kitchen with Noah at the table eating a late lunch and the new latch on the bathroom window still smelling like fresh metal, and when Marta said hello, Emily opened her mouth and what came out was not a sentence. It was something that happened before sentences, a sound that had been compressed for 3 weeks and finally found an exit. Marta said, I'm coming over. You don't have to, Emily. Marta's voice was 63 years of not asking twice. I'm coming over. She arrived in 11 minutes. She came through the front door, looked at Emily's face, looked at Noah, looked at the folder on the kitchen table and sat down. She didn't ask for the whole story at once. She just put both hands flat on the table and said, start wherever you need to start. So Emily started. She talked for 40 minutes. She told Marta about the boot prints and the texts and the calls from the different numbers. She told her about painting the mailbox at 2 a.m. She told her about Jackson Hayes and the convoy and Derek coming out of her house with her folder in his hand and the loose latch on the bathroom window, the one that proved he'd been able to get in for weeks and had chosen not to, because the threat of it was more useful than the act. So when she got to the latch, Marta's expression did something specific. It closed. The way a door closes when someone on the other side of it has finally heard enough. He loosened that latch, Marta said very carefully. Yes. While you didn't know. Yes. Marta was quiet for a moment. Then she said to Noah in a different voice, entirely warm and easy, like switching a channel. Hey, Mr. Noah, you want to go feed my chickens? I think Dollies have been missing you. Noah looked at Emily. She nodded once. He slid off his chair, pulled on his shoes, with the focused ceremony of a child who can tell when adults need the room, and went out the back door. They both listened to his footsteps cross the yard. Then Marta said quietly, that man had access to your house, to your son. I know. Emily, I know. Her voice was flat, not defensive, just full. I know what that means. I've been sitting with what that means since Cole held up that latch and I saw it. She stopped. I've been thinking about every night I slept. Every night I thought the locks were enough. Every night, Noah. Stop, Marta said, not unkindly. Stop doing that to yourself. He didn't. That's the fact. Whatever he could have done, he didn't. You're both here. Because of a mailbox, Emily said. Because I painted a mailbox and a man happened to know Morse code because his father was a ham radio operator 40 years ago. That's how close it was. That one thing, that one accident. Marta looked at her steadily. Or maybe it wasn't an accident. Maybe you put something out into the world and the world sent you back exactly what you needed. Emily shook her head. She wasn't in the mood for comfort shaped like meaning. She was in the mood for facts. He gave me a name, she said. The lawyer, Sandra Reeves, Flagstaff. Good, Marta said immediately. You call her tomorrow morning first thing. I'll drive you. Marta, you don't... I know I don't have to. I want to. She reached across the table and put one hand over Emily's. And this folder is coming home with me tonight. I've got the safe. You know I've got the safe. Emily looked at this folder, at everything she'd documented. Every text, every photograph, every date and time and description written in her careful handwriting because she'd been too afraid to trust. Just the phone screenshots had printed everything and written it all out by hand as a backup because Derek had a way of making digital things disappear. There are copies, she said. I emailed copies to an account he doesn't know about. Marta's eyebrows went up slightly. You thought of that? I thought of everything I could think of, Emily said. It just wasn't enough. It was enough to still be here, Marta said. Sometimes enough looks smaller than it is. They sat in the kitchen as the afternoon light shifted, and Marta made tea without asking, and Emily let her because some acts of care you accept not because you need the tea, but because the person offering it needs to offer it, and love sometimes operates best when it's kept busy. Outside, they could hear Noah talking to the chickens in the specific, earnest way he talked to animals, as if they understood everything, but had simply chosen to respond in a different format. It was the most ordinary sound in the world. Emily put both hands around her mug and held it and tried to let the warmth reach all the way through. She did not entirely succeed, but she tried. Sandra Reeves called first. That was the thing Emily hadn't expected. She'd planned to call in the morning to had set an alarm, had even written out what she was going to say on the back of an envelope the night before so she wouldn't fumble it. But at 8:17 the next morning, while she was making Noah's breakfast and listening to the school bus grind to a stop 2 roads over, her phone rang with a Flagstaff area code she didn't recognize. Emily Carter, a woman's voice. Direct, brisk in a way that wasn't unfriendly, just efficient, the voice of someone for whom time had a specific and understood value. Yes. Sandra Reeves, Jackson Hayes called me last night. Emily set down the spatula. He called you last night. He did. He told me the situation. I'd like to meet with you today, if you can manage it. I know that's short notice. If you need to arrange childcare, my neighbor can watch my son. The words came out of her before she'd even fully decided. What time? 11, my office. I'll text you the address. A brief pause. And Mrs. Carter, bring everything you have. Every copy, every format. Don't leave anything at the house. Emily looked at the kitchen counter. The folder was at Marta's. The email backup was in the cloud. She had a USB drive with heffies that she'd made 3 weeks ago and hidden in the bottom of her winter boot in the closet because she'd been too scared to think of a better place. And a winter boot in Arizona in summer was a reasonable bet that Derek wouldn't bother with it. I have everything, she said. Good, Sandra said. I'll see you at 11. Because she hung up, and Emily stood in the kitchen holding the phone, and Noah said from the table without looking up from his cereal, was that good news or bad news? Good news, Emily said, and the specific quality of that truth, clean, unqualified something she hadn't been able to say in weeks, made her exhale so completely that she had to hold the counter for a second. Okay, Noah said. He went back to his cereal. She watched him for a moment, his small shoulders, the way he held his spoon, the dinosaur on his shirt. She thought about the window latch. She shut the thought down hard. Marta was right. He was here. She was here. Forward was the only direction that mattered now. She picked up the spatula and finished making breakfast. Sandra Reeves's office was on the second floor of a building that had seen better decades but maintained itself with a quiet stubbornness that Emily found immediately trustworthy. Sandra herself was 50-something, gray-streaked hair, pulled back with a pragmatism that matched her voice, and she had the particular manner of a woman who had spent years in rooms where people said things that were difficult to hear and had developed a specific disciplined compassion for it, present without being sentimental, warm without being soft. Yet she looked at the folder for 7 minutes without speaking. She read the printed texts. She examined the photographs of the boot prints. She read Emily's handwritten notes, the dates, the times, the descriptions of every car that slowed every text from every new number. Every morning she'd gone outside and found something slightly wrong in a way she could feel but not entirely prove. Then she put the folder down and looked at Emily. He's been building something, Sandra said. What do you mean? The way he's operated, no direct contact that crosses a legal line, No physical trespass you could prove before we found that latch communication. That's technically legal on its face. She tapped the folder. This isn't a man who got out of prison and came back angry. This is a man who planned, who knew exactly where the legal lines were and stayed a half step behind them while making sure you knew he was there. Emily nodded. She had known this. She had felt it. But hearing someone else name it precisely made it land differently, heavier and lighter at the same time. The latch changes things, Sandra continued. Criminal trespass, potentially breaking and entering, depending on what we can establish about intent. Combined with this documented pattern of behavior, we have the foundation for a stalking charge, a restraining order, and potentially a violation of the conditions of his parole, because I'd be very surprised if those conditions didn't include a no-contact provision. Emily went still. His parole, she said. When a violent offender is released, there are conditions. Contact with victims is almost universally prohibited. Sandra met her eyes. Did anyone from Victim Services tell you this? They told me I could be notified of the release. I was notified. No one, she stopped. No one explained what the conditions meant, what I could do with them. Barbara's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Emily recognized it as the controlled anger of someone professional enough not to perform outrage, but honest enough not to conceal it entirely. If Derek Voss contacted you at all, a single text, a single call after his release, he may have been in violation of parole from the start. She paused. When was the first contact? Emily thought back. The first text, the one that had come 11 days after she'd gotten the release notification. She'd screenshotted it and saved it and told herself it was probably just him making a point, seeing if she'd react that it didn't mean. 11 months ago, she said. Sandra looked at her for a moment. He's been in potential parole violation for 11 months, she said, quietly, with an evenness that cost her something. The silence that followed was the specific silence of understanding, arriving too late, and having to be accepted anyway. Emily said, what happens now, happens. Now, Sandra said, I make some phone calls. The parole board first, then the county sheriff, and before you tell me, the sheriff already came out and looked at boot prints. Yes, I know how that went, and this conversation will go differently than that one did. She closed the folder with a precision that felt like a door being sealed. Do you have somewhere safe to stay while this moves? Not the house, at least for a few days. Marta, my neighbor. Good. Go there tonight. Take your son. She held Emily's gaze. This is going to move quickly now. When people start making calls about parole violations, things accelerate. Derek will find out something has shifted, and men like him tend to make a decision in that moment. Usually a stupid one. I want you out of that house when he makes it. Emily nodded. Her hands were folded in her lap, very still. Miss Carter, Sandra said, you documented everything, meticulously. You made copies. You found a way to signal for help when every normal channel felt closed to you. She paused. I want you to know that is not a small thing. Most people in your situation stop being able to think clearly after the first week. You never stop thinking. Emily looked at the folder on the desk. I had a son upstairs, she said. Sandra nodded once. That's usually the reason. Derek Voss found out something had shifted at 2:17 that afternoon. Emily didn't know this yet. She was at Marta's by then, Noah doing homework at Marta's kitchen table with Dolly the chicken inexplicably allowed inside and sitting near his feet because Marta had long since stopped enforcing certain boundaries. And Emily was packing a bag in a methodical way that kept her hands from shaking. Derek found out because his parole officer called him. And the parole officer's name was Gerald Timms, and Gerald Timms had received a very specific and very well-documented call from a Flagstaff attorney that afternoon. And Gerald Timms, unlike the county deputy who had looked at boot prints for 30 seconds, had been doing this job for 19 years and had a finely calibrated instinct for the difference between a woman being dramatic and a woman who had been quietly surviving something for 11 months while nobody paid adequate attention. Yeah, and he told Derek to come in. Derek said he was busy. Gerald Timms said it wasn't a request. Derek drove in. What happened in that meeting, Emily learned later in pieces from Sandra from the formal paperwork that came after, was that Derek had sat across from Gerald Timms and done the thing he always did. The smooth thing, the reasonable thing, He had a gift for making his version of events feel like the only sensible version, and for most of his life, that gift had served him well. Gerald Timms listened to all of it. Then he put Emily's screenshots on the table. At every text, every new number, every "I just wanted to say hi," every nice mailbox. 11 months of contact that Derek had apparently believed would never be assembled in one place and presented to anyone who mattered. Derek looked at the screenshots. For the first time in this story, he had nothing to say. Gerald Timms said, "Your conditions of release prohibit any contact with Emily Carter or members of her household. I've got documented evidence of repeated contact over 11 months. I'm going to need you to sit right there while I make a phone call." Derek made his decision in that moment. The stupid one, as Sandra had predicted. He stood up. Gerald Timms said, "Sit down, Derek." Derek didn't sit down. And what happened next took 40 seconds. Emily learned this from the police report. Gerald Timms, who was 54 years old and had played linebacker at Arizona State in 1989 and still moved with the particular confidence of a man who has never fully forgotten what his body was capable of, did not allow Derek Voss to leave that office. Derek was placed under arrest for violation of parole conditions at 2:49 p.m. He was processed and held pending a parole revocation hearing. He was not released that night. Emily's phone rang at 4:33. Sandra's voice, precise and quiet the way she had delivered every piece of information that afternoon. "He's in custody," she said. Emily was sitting on Marta's couch with her feet tucked under her and Noah's head on her shoulder. Both of them watching something on television and that she couldn't have named if someone asked, just the comfort of sound and light and her son's weight against her arm. She said very quietly, "Say that again." Derek Voss was taken into custody at 2:49 this afternoon for parole violation. He'll be held pending a hearing. Based on the documentation and the evidence of the window latch, I expect that hearing to result in revocation and a return to custody for the remainder of his original sentence plus potential new charges. Emily closed her eyes. The remainder of his original sentence. She did the math. She had done this math before years ago, looking at parole dates the way people look at weather forecasts when a storm is coming. 3 years minimum, possibly more. 3 years. She felt Noah shift against her shoulder. He looked up. "Mom, you're doing the thing where you stop breathing." She opened her eyes, looked at him. "I'm okay," she said. That was good news again. She looked at his face, at the eyes that were Derek's shape, but nobody's except Noah's own, because a child is not the sins of their father, is not the fear their mother carried, is not anything except themselves completely and entirely. And this one specific boy was the single best thing she had ever done. "Yes," she said, and that was very good news. He leaned his head back on her shoulder. "Goody," he said. "I like good news days." She put her arm around him and held on and looked at nothing in particular at the middle distance, at the ordinary air of Marta's living room, at the fading light through the window. She was thinking about Jackson Hayes on a motorcycle on a county road raising one hand and 30 engines going quiet all at once. Also, she was thinking about what it meant that a man could carry something his father taught him at age 7. A dead language of dots and dashes, a system built for emergencies on frequencies. No one used anymore, and carry it for 4 decades without knowing why. Right up until the afternoon, he rode past a mailbox in northern Arizona, painted by a woman who was running out of options and still refused to stop thinking. She was thinking about the specific, unplannable shape of the things that save us. Marta came in from the kitchen with 3 mugs and set one in front of Noah hot chocolate, because Marta understood priorities, and handed one to Emily and sat in the armchair across from them and said nothing. Just sat. Just was there. The dog was on the floor. The chicken had been returned to the yard. The folder was locked in Marta's safe. Derek Voss was in a cell. And Emily Carter, for the first time in 3 weeks, did not check the locks before she sat down. She just sat. She held the mug. She breathed. And outside, the light was going golden and flat across the Arizona land, and the road past Marta's house was empty and quiet, and somewhere south of them, a convoy of motorcycles was moving through the desert dark, without knowing, without needing to know, that in a living room 40 miles behind them, a woman and her son were finally completely, simply still. The hearing was set for Thursday. Sandra called Monday morning to confirm it, and Emily wrote the date on the back of her hand in ballpoint pen the way she used to write important things in college before she'd learned to trust calendars and systems and official processes. She'd stopped trusting those things somewhere around the time a jury had looked at Derek's lawyer's suit and decided it wasn't quite enough. The back of her hand felt more reliable, more honest, more hers. She was still at Marta's. She'd gone back to her house twice, once to get more clothes for Noah, once to pick up the winter boot from the closet and retrieve the USB drive. And both times she'd stood in her own kitchen for a moment and felt the particular strangeness of a place that looks the same but has been changed by what happened in it. The bathroom window, the back door, the knowledge that someone had stood in this room while she slept. She didn't stay long either time. Noah had adapted to Marta's with the elastic resilience of children who have learned without being told explicitly that adaptation is a form of loyalty to the people they love. He'd claimed the couch cushion closest to the window. He'd made friends with every chicken by name. He did his homework at Marta's kitchen table and ate Marta's cooking, which ran heavily toward casseroles and strong opinions. And on the second night, he'd told Marta that her biscuits were better than his mom's, and then immediately looked at Emily with the panicked expression of someone who has said a true thing at a bad time. Emily had said, "He's right, they are." And Marta had laughed the specific laugh of a woman who has been alone long enough to find unexpected company genuinely delighting rather than merely pleasant. It was almost normal. The almost was doing a lot of work, but Emily had learned to respect what the almost could hold. Now, Monday night after Noah was asleep, Emily sat at Marta's kitchen table with her phone and pulled up the number Jackson had given her, not a personal number, some kind of charter contact line, she wasn't entirely sure, and she typed a message. She sat for 5 minutes looking at what she'd written before she sent it. "He's in custody. Hearing Thursday. Sandra's been extraordinary. I don't know how to say the rest of it, so I'll just say thank you. From both of us." She sent it. She didn't expect a response that night. She got one in 4 minutes. "Glad to hear it. Sandra's the best there is. You did the hard part, you didn't quit." She read it 3 times. Then she set the phone face down on the table and sat with it in the quiet of Marta's kitchen and allowed herself carefully and precisely to feel the specific weight of being seen by someone who had no obligation to see her. It was heavier than she'd expected, and lighter. Tuesday brought something she hadn't anticipated. Sandra called at 9 a.m. and her voice had a different quality, not alarmed, but sharpened the way a voice sharpens when new information has arrived and needs to be delivered in the right order. "I need you to come in this morning," Sandra said. "What happened?" A brief pause. The kind that means I'd rather tell you in person, but the pause itself has already told you enough to know it matters. "Derek's attorney filed a motion last night," Sandra said. "A pre-hearing motion to suppress the documentation on the grounds that it was. And I want to read you his exact language, obtained and presented through third-party intimidation by a criminal organization, specifically the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, compromising the integrity of the evidence chain." Emily sat down. She hadn't been standing near anything to sit on, but her body found the chair, the way bodies do when the ground shifts. "He's saying the evidence is tainted," she said. "He's saying Jackson Hayes and his riders coerced the situation in a way that makes everything that followed legally questionable. He's arguing that without the intervention, without what he's calling an armed home invasion by known criminal associates, Derek would never have been in a position where the parole office was contacted. It wasn't a home invasion. Derek was the one." "I know," Sandra said. "Steady, even. I know that, you know that. Gerald Timms knows that, but Derek's attorney is not arguing facts. He's arguing optics. And optics have a way of working in courtrooms, which is why I need you in here this morning so we can get ahead of this before Thursday." Emily was already standing, already looking for her keys. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. She dropped Noah at school, kissed the top of his head, told him to have a good day, watched him walk through the doors with his backpack and his dinosaur water bottle, ordinary and entire and safe, and drove to Flagstaff with both hands on the wheel and her jaw set. Sandra's office felt different in crisis mode. Same room, same desk, same woman, but the air had a different texture. Focused, compressed. Sandra had the motion on the desk and a yellow legal pad covered in her precise handwriting beside it. She let Emily read the motion first. Emily read it twice. It was well written. That was the worst part. Derek's attorney was not incompetent, and the motion was not frivolous. It was constructed carefully around a genuine legal principle, and it was aimed directly at the one element of this situation that was genuinely complicated. The fact that the intervention had come not from law enforcement, but from a motorcycle club with a significant criminal reputation. He's going to argue that the entire chain of events is poisoned, Emily said. That's his strategy, Sandra confirmed. If he can get the documentation suppressed as fruit of an illegal search and seizure, which is a stretch, but not an impossible argument, and if he can create enough doubt about the circumstances of how Gerald Timms was contacted, he has a shot at getting the parole hearing dismissed or at minimum delayed long enough that Derek walks out of custody pending reevaluation. Emily put the motion down on the desk. Boss, she said, Jackson didn't search anything. He walked into my house because I indicated there was an intruder. Derek was in my house. Yes, but Jackson is not law enforcement. He has no authority to enter a dwelling, and Derek's attorney is going to argue that what looked like a citizen's intervention was actually unlawful entry by multiple individuals with gang affiliations, which constitutes. Derek's gang affiliations are documented in his original conviction, Emily said. Sandra paused. Say that again, she said. Derek Voss, his original charges, the assault and weapons charges. Part of the prosecution's case was that he ran with a crew loosely organized, not a formal organization, but documented criminal associations. It's in the trial record. Emily met Sandra's eyes. His attorney is going to argue that Jackson's associations make the intervention illegitimate, but Derek's associations are part of why he was in prison in the first place. If we're going to talk about the character of who was in that house, Derek brought that argument to the wrong table. Sandra looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote something on the legal pad. You just gave me the counter motion, she said. Is it enough? It's a very good start. Sandra was already writing faster. The other piece is consent. You invited Jackson into your home. You were on the property. The folder Derek attempted to take was taken from the common area of your kitchen without your permission. That's not a search and seizure issue, that's theft. And the documentation of Derek's communications predates the intervention entirely. Nothing Jackson did created that evidence. It existed before he ever stopped. So the motion doesn't hold. Not if we argue it correctly. Sandra looked up. But here's the thing, Emily. Thursday's hearing just became more complicated. Derek's attorney is going to use the time between now and Thursday to generate as much noise as possible about Jackson Hayes and the club. He's going to make this about the bikers rather than his client. He's going to ask the board to be more troubled by Jackson's record than by Derek's. Emily said Jackson's record. Sandra's expression told her before her words did. Jackson Hayes has prior convictions, Sandra said carefully. Nothing recent, nothing in the last decade. But the history is there, and Derek's attorney found it, and he's going to put it in front of the board as aggressively as he can. Emily absorbed this. She sat with it the way she'd learned to sit with difficult information, not pushing it away, not drowning in it, just letting it settle to the bottom and seeing what it looked like from there. She said Jackson's past doesn't change what Derek did to me, or what he was doing in my house. No, Sandra said, it doesn't, but it changes the story Derek's attorney gets to tell. And story matters. Then we tell a better story. Sandra looked at her. Yes, she said, we do. The better story required one thing Emily hadn't counted on. Sandra needed a statement from Jackson Hayes. Not testimony, not a courtroom appearance, nothing that formal. A written statement, an account of what he had observed, what he had recognized, what had prompted the convoy to stop. Clean, factual, signed. I'm not sure he'll do it, Emily said. Why not? Well, she thought about Jackson sitting at her kitchen table, both hands around a coffee mug, the way he'd said we got there too late about his daughter and left everything unsaid that surrounded it, the way he and his writers had left without signatures, without credit, without anything that would attach their names to what they'd done. He didn't want recognition, Emily said. He helped and he left. I think there's a reason for that. There usually is with men like him, Sandra said, without judgment. Just acknowledgement. But this isn't recognition. This is a legal record. And without it, Derek's attorney gets to define what happened at your house by himself. Jackson's silence at this point is actually a gift to Derek. Emily sat with that. Then she picked up her phone. She used the contact line. She typed more than she'd typed the night before, and she was careful with the words because she knew they mattered. She explained the motion. She explained what Sandra needed. She explained in the plainest terms she could that the man who had helped her might now, by virtue of his absence from the record, inadvertently help the man who had been terrorizing her. She set the phone on Sandra's desk. They waited 11 minutes. The response came in 2 sentences. Tell your lawyer I'll call her directly. Give her my number. Emily exhaled. Sandra was already holding out her hand for the phone. She didn't hear the specifics of that conversation. Sandra took it in the other room, which was right and appropriate, and Emily sat in the waiting area and looked at the floor and thought about the particular architecture of how help moves through the world, not in straight lines, not through the channels designed for it, but sideways and unexpectedly through the knowledge. A father gave a 7-year-old boy through a paint can in a shed through a convoy that happened to take one specific road on one specific afternoon. She thought about Derek's attorney's motion, the way it tried to use Jackson against her, the way it tried to reframe the story so that the people who stopped were the problem and the person who didn't stop was the victim. She thought about how many times in her life she'd watched that reframing happen. In the courtroom 4 years ago, in the deputy's expression when he'd looked at boot prints and said hikers, hunters, in every system that had looked at her situation and calculated that the cost of acting was higher than the cost of waiting. She thought about what it meant that in the end, the help that arrived had come from outside every one of those systems. Not because the systems were entirely broken, but because systems are made of people, and people have to decide to use the systems, and Derek was very good at making people decide not to. Jackson Hayes had not given Derek that decision. That was the thing. That was the whole thing distilled. Sandra came back after 22 minutes. She had the legal pad in her hand and more notes on it than when she'd left, and her expression had shifted into something that Emily was beginning to recognize as Sandra's version of cautious optimism, contained professional but present. He'll provide the statement, Sandra said. He was direct. That's the right word, Emily said. He told me something I want to share with you. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, that he didn't stop at your house because he was looking for trouble. He stopped because he recognized a signal that meant someone was out of options and asking for help the only way they had left. He said that's the entire story, and he'll say so in writing. Emily nodded. He also said something else. Sandra paused. He said that if Derek's attorney wants to spend the hearing talking about Jackson's past instead of Derek's present, that's fine, because the board will still have to explain in the end why a woman had to paint her mailbox in Morse code at 2 a.m. because no official channel felt safe enough to use. Emily looked at her hands. That sentence. It was the thing she hadn't been able to say cleanly, the thing that lived at the center of the whole story, not the drama of Derek, not the arrival of the convoy, but the quiet, terrible fact of the mailbox, of what it meant that she had been reduced to that, of what it said about every door she'd knocked on before she picked up a paintbrush. He's right, she said. He is, Sandra said, and I intend to make sure the board hears it exactly that way. Wednesday passed in the specific suspended time quality of the day before something important. Emily went back to her house fully this time with intent and cleaned it the way she hadn't been able to clean it in weeks. Not because it needed cleaning for anyone else, because she needed to do it for herself. Because reclaiming a space sometimes requires going over it with your own hands and insisting physically and repeatedly that it belongs to you. She washed floors. She fixed a cabinet hinge that had been loose for a month. She replaced the bathroom window latch with a second heavier one that Cole had left behind, along with a business card with a handwritten note on the back that just said double up. She stood in every room and looked at it and decided it was hers. Noah came home from school and found her on her knees scrubbing the kitchen floor with an intensity that made him stop in the doorway. He said, "Are we okay?" She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "We're better than okay," she said. "How was school?" Brandon Kowalski said motorcycles are dangerous. Brandon Kowalski's not wrong. I told him sometimes they show up when you need them. Well, she looked at her son, 8 years old, both of Derek's eyes and none of Derek's anything else, because whatever came from her side had been stronger, or maybe because the boy himself had simply decided who he was going to be without consulting either parent's blueprint. Yeah, she said. Sometimes they do. She got up off the floor and hugged him, and he let her for a moment before wiggling away with the dignity of a second grader who has a reputation to maintain. Can we have pizza tonight? He asked. Yes, she said. We absolutely can. They had pizza. They watched something with dinosaurs because it was Noah's turn to choose, and it was always dinosaurs. Emily sat on the couch with her son and ate pizza and felt the specific texture of an ordinary evening after weeks of ordinary evenings being a thing she couldn't afford to believe in. She fell asleep on the couch before the movie ended, and she didn't check the locks first, and she slept without dreaming. Thursday arrived like something that had been built toward because it had. As Sandra had told her, she didn't need to be present at the parole revocation hearing. It was an administrative proceeding, not a trial. Emily wasn't required. She could stay home. She could take Noah to school and clean her kitchen again, or sit on her porch and watch the road and let Sandra handle the rest. She went anyway. She sat in the hallway outside the hearing room in a plastic chair that reminded her of waiting rooms she'd sat in before in courtrooms, in hospitals, in government offices, the universal furniture of waiting for people with authority to decide things that control your life. She had her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her expression neutral, and she was wearing the same thing she'd worn to her first meeting with Sandra because it had felt right then, and she was superstitious about it now. She didn't go in, but she was there. She wanted Derek to know she was there. 30 minutes and the door opened, and a clerk came out and looked at her and said in the careful tone of someone delivering news that is simultaneously significant and something they are not allowed to editorialize. Mrs. Carter, they have asked if you'd like to give a brief victim impact statement. You're not required to. She stood up before the clerk finished the sentence. She'd thought about what she would say. She'd thought about it in the car and the night before, and in pieces over the past 3 weeks, the things she'd wanted to say to a room that would listen and act on what it heard. She'd had speeches prepared and dismantled and prepared again. In the end, standing in front of the board, 4 people at a table, Gerald Timms to one side, Derek and his attorney, on the other, Sandra at her shoulder. She didn't say any of them. She said this, and I painted my mailbox in Morse code because I didn't believe anyone official would stop for me. I want you to know that, not as an accusation, as a fact. I had called the sheriff. I had the victim notification. I had documentation, and I was still alone in a house with a man who had loosened my bathroom window latch so he could come in whenever he decided to. That's where I was. That's what drove me to a paintbrush at 2 a.m, hoping anyone would recognize 3 dots and 3 dashes and understand that I was out of other options. She paused. She did not look at Derek. She looked at the board. A stranger stopped, she said. A man who learned Morse code from his father 40 years ago stopped his motorcycle on a county road because he saw a pattern that meant something to him. He didn't know me. He had no reason to stop. He stopped anyway. And because he stopped, I'm standing here today with evidence intact and a son who slept in his own bed last night. She paused again. I'd like the board to consider what that means, she said. Not just about Derek Voss, about what it means that my safest option was a mailbox. She sat down. Sandra put her hand briefly on Emily's arm. 1 second, then removed it. The room was very quiet. Derek's attorney started to speak. The board chair raised one hand and he stopped. Sopo, the board chair. A woman in her 60s named Carol Whitfield, who had seen enough of these proceedings to carry that experience in the lines of her face without wearing it, as performance looked at Emily for a moment. Then she looked at the documentation. Then she looked at Derek. She said, we'll take a brief recess. The recess was 14 minutes. Emily spent it in the hallway again. Sandra came out and stood beside her and didn't offer reassurances, which was exactly right because Sandra understood that Emily didn't want to be managed. How did it look? Emily asked. Carol Whitfield has been on that board for 11 years, Sandra said. I've been in front of her 6 times. She doesn't call a recess when she's undecided. She calls a recess when she's decided and she wants the room to understand it before she says it out loud. Emily nodded. She looked at the door. She thought about the mailbox, about the paint can in the shed, about 2 a.m. and no options, and the decision to do something even when something felt like almost nothing. The door opened. She went back in. Carol Whitfield looked at Derek Voss with the expression of someone who has weighed a thing and found it precisely as heavy as it needed to be. She said, Mr. Voss, the board finds that you have violated the conditions of your supervised release in multiple documented and deliberate ways over a period of 11 months. The motion to suppress is denied. The documentation stands. Effective immediately, your parole is revoked and you will be remanded to serve the remainder of your original sentence. She paused. Additionally, she said, I'm referring the evidence of unlawful entry to the county prosecutor's office. That referral is separate from this proceeding and will move on its own timeline. Derek didn't react. He was very still. The specific stillness of a man processing that the calculation he had made, patient, careful, methodical, had come out wrong. That all the precision had not been enough. That somewhere in the arithmetic he had missed a variable. He turned his head and looked at Emily. She met his eyes. She held them. She did not look away. He looked away first. The deputies who had been standing by the door moved forward, and Derek stood because there was nothing else to do, and he was taken out of the room through a door that Emily would never have to walk through. And she watched him go with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her expression exactly as neutral as it had been when she walked in. The room began to move again. Papers, voices, Sandra's hand on her arm a second time, and this time it stayed. Emily looked at the door Derek had gone through. She thought 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. She thought someone finally stopped. She let out a breath that she had been holding in one form or another for 4 years. And then she picked up her bag and she stood up and she walked out of the room into the hallway where the plastic chairs sat against the wall, and she took out her phone and she sent one message to a contact line for a motorcycle charter in northern Arizona. It said, "It's done, he's remanded. Thank you for the statement. Thank you for stopping." She pressed send. She walked to the elevator. Her phone buzzed once before the doors closed. She looked at the screen. One word. Good. She put the phone in her pocket. The elevator doors opened. She walked out into the afternoon and called Marta, and then called Noah's school, and then stood in the parking lot with her face tilted up toward the flat blue Arizona sky and breathed in and breathed out, and listened to the particular sound of a world that had rearranged itself into something she could live in again. Somewhere on a highway, she thought a convoy was moving. Not toward her, not away from her, just moving the way they always moved through the desert in the distance, carrying 40 years of a dead language and the instinct of a man who had learned from his father that you should always know how to send a message when the normal lines are down. She got in her car. She drove to pick up her son. Noah was waiting at the curb when she pulled up. He had his backpack on both shoulders, which meant a good day. On bad days, he carried it by one strap, dragging it slightly the way a person carries something they've lost interest in. Both straps meant he had energy left over. It meant the day had given him more than it had taken. She watched him spot her car and break into the loose, unself-conscious run of a child who hasn't yet learned to be careful about showing that he's glad to see someone. He hit the passenger door and got in and dropped his backpack at his feet and said before she'd said a single word, "Did it happen?" She looked at him. "Did what happen?" she said, testing, wanting to know how much he'd been carrying in that small chest all day while she'd been in a hearing room in Flagstaff. He looked at her with Derek's eyes and nobody's expression but his own. "Mom, did the thing happen that was supposed to happen today?" "Yes," she said, "the thing happened." He nodded, the way he nodded when a piece of information confirmed what he'd already decided to believe. Then he reached into his backpack and produced a slightly crushed granola bar and held it out to her. "I saved this for you," he said. "I figured you didn't eat lunch." She took the granola bar. She did not trust her voice for a moment. "Thank you," she managed. "You're welcome." He buckled his seatbelt. "Can we get Dairy Queen?" She laughed. The same involuntary, uncontainable kind she'd produced the day he'd told Jackson he had good lungs. The kind that comes from somewhere below decision-making. "Yes," she said, "we absolutely can get Dairy Queen." She pulled out of the school parking lot and drove south and let the afternoon happen around them. Ordinary and complete. Noah telling her about a project on weather systems. Something about a disagreement with Brandon Kowalski, about whether lightning was actually just electricity, The specific social injustice of being assigned to work with someone who argues about lightning when everyone knows what lightning is. She listened to all of it. She asked the right questions in the right places. She ate the granola bar with one hand on the wheel. It's this. She had been fighting for this. Not for the courtroom win, not for the revocation, not for Derek's face when he looked away first. For this specific, unremarkable thing driving her son home from school on a Thursday afternoon while he talked about lightning and Brandon Kowalski. This was the whole point. This had always been the whole point. She did not say any of this to Noah. She didn't need to. She just drove and listened and let herself be entirely present in the small, ordinary world she had refused to stop protecting. She called Sandra from Marta's driveway that evening after Noah was inside and out of earshot, because there was one question she hadn't asked in the hearing room, one thing that had been sitting at the back of her mind since Carol Whitfield said the word remanded, and she'd watched Derek go through that door. How long, she asked when Sandra picked up. Realistically. Minimum of 3 years on the remainder, Sandra said, with the prosecutor's referral for the unlawful entry, potentially more. That case will develop on its own timeline, but the parole revocation alone gives you at minimum 3 years before any release conversation happens. And when it does happen, and you'll be notified immediately, we're updating your victim services contact information today and flagging it for automatic notification. Additionally, I'm filing for a protective order that will survive any release. He cannot contact you, cannot come within a defined distance of your home, your workplace, your son's school. Violation is automatic rearrest. A pause. Emily, this is not the same situation as 4 years ago. The record is different now. You are different now. Emily considered that. She looked at the sky getting dark above Marta's yard, the first stars appearing in the specific, unhurried way of Arizona evenings one at a time, like an argument being made carefully. Sandra, she said, thank you for how you handled all of it. The motion, the counter-motion Jackson's statement, the impact statement, you told me I didn't have to. You needed to, Sandra said, simply, accurately. Yeah, Emily said, nice. I did. Hey, Carol Whitfield told me afterward off the record that the mailbox thing was the moment, not the documentation, not the parole violations. The mailbox. A brief pause. She said she'd been doing this for 11 years and she'd never heard anything like it. Emily said nothing for a moment. I just needed someone to stop, she said finally. I know, Sandra said, and one did. The twist came 9 days later. Emily was at work. Hattie's Diner Tuesday morning, the burned coffee, and the vinyl booths and the jukebox that still didn't work. She was refilling Jimmy Rourke's cup table 4 black coffee, 2 sugars, same as always, when Hattie herself came through the kitchen door and stood behind the counter with her arms folded and her expression doing something complicated. Ma, Hattie was not a complicated woman by nature. She was direct the way a hammer is direct. When her expression did something complicated, you paid attention. You got visitors, Hattie said. Emily looked toward the front of the diner. 3 people. A woman she didn't recognize, 40s sharp-faced, a press badge clipped to her jacket. A man with a camera hanging loose at his side. And behind them, sitting in the last booth by the window, like he'd been there for hours, a coffee mug already in front of him, Jackson Hayes. Emily set the coffee pot down on the counter. Mum, she looked at Jackson. He raised his chin slightly in acknowledgement. Not an apology for being there, not a performance of casual. Just the same economy of motion she'd come to understand was simply how he operated. The woman with the press badge stepped forward. Miss Carter, I'm Diane Marsh, Arizona Daily Independent. I've been covering the Voss case since the revocation. I'd love to talk to you when you have a few minutes. I've already spoken to Mr. Hayes. Emily looked at Jackson. He said from the booth without moving, I didn't bring her. She found me. How did she find you? Emily asked. Same way people find things they're determined to find, he said. She's persistent. Diane Marsh had the grace to look moderately sheepish about this. Emily looked at her, at the camera, at the press badge, and she thought about what Sandra had said the mailbox thing was the moment. She thought about Carol Whitfield's off-the-record comment. She thought about the fact that a story this specific, this strange, this involving the Hells Angels and a Morse code message hidden in painted triangles was not going to stay quiet indefinitely regardless of what she did. She thought about all the women who were right now standing behind doors, thinking about how thin the doors were. She said, "Give me 10 minutes to finish my section, then I'll take my break." She went back to work. She refilled 2 more tables, dropped a check at table 7, confirmed that, yes, the apple pie was fresh because Hattie made it every morning, and then she untied her apron and folded it over the counter and went to sit across from Diane Marsh. Uta Jackson stayed in his booth. She thought he might leave, but he didn't. He just sat with his coffee and kept a particular quality of attention on the room that she recognized by now, not watching backly, but present in the specific way of a person who has decided to be available if needed. She found that she was glad he was there. "Tell me about the mailbox," Diane said. And Emily told her, not everything, not the deepest things, not Noah's voice asking, "Is it the man?" Not the winter boot with the USB drive, not Derek's face when he looked away first. Some things belonged only to the people who had lived them. But the shape of the story, the architecture of it, the weeks of silence, the paintbrush at 2 a.m, the convoy, the latch on the bathroom window, the hearing, she laid it out with the same precision she used on her handwritten documentation. Clear, factual, without melodrama because the facts were dramatic enough and she'd never needed to perform distress to communicate that it was real. Diane listened without interrupting. She was good at that, the particular professional discipline of staying out of the way of a story that knows how to move on its own. When Emily finished, Diane sat for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want people to take from this?" Now, Emily thought about it. She'd expected a different question. How did you feel? What would you say to other women? What's your message? Those questions had a shape she could have navigated easily and meaninglessly. This one was more honest. "I want people to understand that the mailbox wasn't brave," Emily said. "I want them to understand that it was what was left. After everything else had been tried and hadn't worked, and I was running out of time and options. The mailbox was the bottom of the barrel." She paused. "I'm not a symbol. I'm a woman who got very creative when I got very scared. The brave thing, if there's a brave thing in this story, is that someone stopped to look." Diane wrote something. "Jackson Hayes," she said. "For the record, what do you want to say about him?" Emily thought about the convoy going quiet off all at once, about Hector saying it won't work this time before she even knew what Derek was saying inside her house, about Jackson at her kitchen table, both hands around a mug, saying we got there too late about his daughter, and then leaving that sentence alone because some things don't need a response, just room. "He taught me something," Emily said. "What?" "That sometimes the help you need isn't in the system," she said. "Not because the system is entirely broken, but because systems wait for proof and predators know how to stay behind the line until the proof runs out. Jackson didn't wait for proof. He saw a signal. He stopped. He acted on what was in front of him." She looked at her hands. "That's not a replacement for the system. The system still needs to work better. But that day, that specific day, what I needed was a person who paid attention when everyone else drove past." She looked up. Diane was watching her with an expression that wasn't journalistic neutrality anymore. It was something more personal than that. Emily recognized it as the expression of a woman hearing a thing she needed to hear for reasons that had nothing to do with the article she was writing. She didn't mention it. Some things you see and don't say. "One more question," Diane said. "The Morse code, where did you learn it?" "Oh," Emily almost smiled. "I was a weird kid, read everything, stayed in the library at lunch because I didn't have a lot of friends and the librarian let me read whatever I wanted. There was a book on communication systems, naval signals, telegraph, Morse code. I learned it the way you learn things when you're 12 years old and you don't know why yet." She paused. "I hadn't thought about it in 20 years, and then I needed it." Diane Marsh sat back. "Ms. Carter," she said, "this is one of the most extraordinary stories I've ever been assigned." "It's an ordinary story," Emily said quietly. "It just had an unusual ending." The article ran the following Thursday. Emily read it at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee. Noah having already been deposited at school. The house quiet and entirely hers in the morning light. Diane had written it well. She had the restraint to let the facts carry the weight without dressing them up, which was exactly right because the facts were enough. The headline said she painted an SOS in her mailbox, A biker stopped. Emily read it once. Then she set her phone face down and looked out the kitchen window at the yard at the mailbox, visible at the end of the driveway, sitting in the ordinary morning light, with its careful painted triangles catching the sun, the same way they had the afternoon Jackson had traced his finger along the pattern, and looked up and changed everything. Her phone started ringing at 9 a.m. and didn't meaningfully stop for 3 days. And women from Tucson and Phoenix and Flagstaff, and places she'd never been, and places she couldn't immediately place on a map. Some of them had specific things to tell her, situations, names, versions of the same shape of fear she knew intimately. Some of them just said, "Thank you for telling it." One woman called from a gas station in New Mexico, voice barely above a whisper, and said she'd been trying to figure out what to do for 6 months, and she didn't know what her version of the mailbox was yet, but now she was going to find one. Emily talked to as many of them as she could. She gave them Sandra's number when it was appropriate. She gave them the National Domestic Violence Hotline number every time without exception. She said the same thing to each of them in different arrangements of the same words: document everything. Trust your instincts. Find one person who will actually listen, and don't stop looking for the signal that someone will see. She was not a counselor. She was not an expert. She was just a woman who had been through a specific thing and survived it and was willing to say so out loud. Sometimes that's what's needed, not expertise, just the knowledge that someone else was standing in the same dark and found a way to make light. The twist she hadn't anticipated, the one that arrived quietly without fanfare 3 weeks after the article ran, came in the form of a letter, handwritten, postmarked Florence, Arizona. No return address, but she knew the postmark. She stood at the mailbox, her mailbox with its triangles still painted in careful angles along the post, and held the envelope for a long moment without opening it. She thought about throwing it away unopened. She thought about giving it to Sandra. She opened it. Inside was one page. The handwriting was Derek's. She would have known it anywhere. That particular combination of deliberate neatness and underlying pressure, like someone performing calm. It said, "I didn't think anyone would stop." That was all. 7 words, no greeting, no signature. She read them twice. She stood at the end of her driveway in the morning with the letter in her hand, and she thought about those 7 words for a long time, about what they meant and what they didn't mean, and whether they were meant to frighten her, or whether somewhere in whatever Derek Voss was made of, they were as close as he would ever come to saying that he had miscalculated something fundamental. She decided it didn't matter which. She took the letter inside. She photographed it. She sent the photograph to Sandra. Then she put the letter in a drawer, not the kitchen drawer, a different one in her bedroom, because she intended to give it to the prosecutor when the unlawful entry case moved forward, and prosecutors liked primary documents. And she closed the drawer, and she went to make Noah's after-school snack, because he'd be home in an hour, and he'd want something with peanut butter. And this was the actual life she was living now, the unremarkable, irreplaceable, actual life. Later, she thought about Derek's 7 words. "I didn't think anyone would stop." And she thought about all the people who had driven past her mailbox for 12 days. All the cars and trucks, and the school bus, and the mail carrier who'd opened the box and closed it and driven on. She thought about how close Derek had been to being right, how thin the margin was. One man who'd learned one thing from his father at age 7, carrying it for 40 years, through a life that had taken him places neither of them had planned, right up until an afternoon on a county road in northern Arizona, where he raised one hand and 30 engines went silent. She thought about what it meant that the world could hinge on something that small. And then she thought about the fact that it had hinged in her direction, because she hadn't stopped. Because at 2 a.m, with nothing left, she'd gone to the shed and found the paint and refused to quit looking for a way to be heard. Because some part of her had insisted past exhaustion and fear and every reasonable calculation that said it wouldn't work, that someone out there was paying attention. She had been right. Not because the universe owed it to her, not because good things happen to people who deserve them. She knew better than that, had known it, since a jury decided insufficient evidence was the same as innocent. But because she had kept sending the signal, and the signal had found the one person in the world who could read it. That was the whole story. Not a miracle, not fate, a woman who refused to go quiet, and a man who refused to look away. And between those two stubborn, unlikely facts, a child had grown up safe 6 weeks after the hearing on a Saturday morning, when the air was just beginning to carry the first suggestion of cooler weather coming, Noah came downstairs and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Mom, there are motorcycles on the road." Emily looked up from her coffee. She went to the front door and opened it. The convoy was not stopping this time. It was moving through south the same direction as before, the same organized, easy pace, the same deep rolling sound that settled into the chest like something that had always been there. But as the lead bike passed the end of her driveway, the rider raised one hand, a single raised fist. Not stopping, not performing anything, just acknowledging. The way you acknowledge someone across a room when words aren't the right tool and presence is enough. She raised her hand back. She stood in her doorway until the sound faded south and the road was quiet, and the morning was just a morning again. Noah came and stood beside her, his shoulder against her arm, looking at the empty road. "Was that him?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Will they come back?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe, maybe not, but that's okay." He leaned against her. "Because we're okay now." "Because we're okay now," she said. It's done. She put her arm around her son and held him in the doorway of their house on a quiet road in northern Arizona where the mailbox stood in the morning light with its careful triangles still painted along the post. Not a signal anymore, not a message to anyone, just paint on wood, just evidence that a woman had stood in the dark and refused to be silent, and the world had sent back exactly what she needed. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for someone to notice. Emily Carter painted a message in a language almost no one speaks anymore, hung it at the end of her driveway, and a man who loved his father enough to remember what his father taught him came riding down the right road at the right moment. And that was enough. That was exactly, permanently, irrevocably enough.